This is Carole. This evening's speaker is Carole MacDonald, and her presentation is entitled J.B. McLachlan, Labor Hero or Opportunist. Carole has an MA in Atlantic Canada Studies from St. Mary's University, a Bachelor of Journalism from the University of King's College, a BA from Mount St. Vincent University, a diploma in education, and certificates in business, community economic development, and adult education. Her book, Historic Glace Bay, was published in 2009, and she's currently seeking a publisher for her biography of Gordon Harrington, Nova Scotia's 11th Premier. Carole is the daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of Glace Bay coal miners. She has questions this evening about the legacy of the man labor historians claim fought for the miners in early 20th century Cape Breton. We look forward to this. Carole, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lois, for that introduction, and thank Sarah and Sarah for helping me pull this program together this evening. I haven't done this before, so I'm hoping people will bear with me if I make a few flubs here and there. As Lois said, I'm the daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of coal miners, and I grew up in Glace Bay and think I have a pretty good handle on coal miners and who they were and what they thought. And for that reason, when I will say that there was a time that I just accepted the philosophy that James McLachlan, that old Jim McLachlan, fought for the miners. But when doing my Glace Bay book, which Lois mentioned, I got more interested in learning about Gordon Harrington. And he became the subject of my thesis from St. Mary's, my master's, and actually is one of the mayors that David Frank left out of his article on, company towns, labor towns. And it won't surprise anybody because of the copious amount of writing that David Frank has done on J.B. McLachlan, that he's probably the major source of information for this presentation. I have read other articles as well from Stephen Penfound and John Manley, and I'm sorry, Ian McKay, and some reference to John Miller, because I was told by a colleague that his book, Company Store, is the Bible of Cape Breton. So to start, in order to accept that J.B. McLachlan fought for the miners, you also have to accept the following presumptions. The stereotype that all miners' families freezing and starving in company houses, in debt to the company store, and victimized by a callous coal company. That J.B. McLachlan dedicated his life to trying to help the coal miners of Nova Scotia, and was always sincere and truthful in his writings and speeches. And that the majority of miners saw communism, as preached by McLachlan, as the way to improve their lives. My slides are not moving. Hello?
Hi, Carole. Are you using the arrows on your keyboard?
I am.
And they're not moving?
They're not moving. Besides the fact that they're not moving, I also have my picture with 3 names listed on the right side. Yeah, so this is where we are. I'm frozen at the moment. And since I didn't send you a copy of the slides, oh dear. So should I just go ahead and, what should we do? Sorry, everybody.
It's okay. It's okay. Are you like, is your mouse on the PowerPoint right now?
My mouse is now.
Oh,
There
there.
we go. Here we go. But again, if I could move that, well, never mind, I can see around this, I think.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, I do have Lois's name and Rosemary's and James. Hi, James. Down the side in the middle of what I'm reading, actually.
Hi, Carol.
That's fine, but is it impeding your view of what
It
you're?
is.
Oh,
Can you people read it? Are you able to see what
yes,
it is?
everyone should be able to see it. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Yes.
All right, so
we can see it.
if I will just quietly read what I can, and if you will. So what happened was in, I think it was 1964, that I think Underwood wrote an article stating, as for the Maritime provinces, nothing of course ever happens down there. Ernie Forbes from UMB took exception to that, as did other people, and he wrote this quote, which really goes to what I have to say tonight, that so much of what we have is just repetition of the same old things, of a stereotype, and accepting a fact without critical analysis, and having fact and fiction all jumbled together. And John Ralston Saul also said in, what is it, Siamese Twins? Reflections of Siamese Twins, there it is on the bottom. When a knowledge vacuum exists, it's filled with false versions of events. The resulting distortions can be used to push a particular political agenda. Oh yeah, I want to thank Helen Forsey for reminding me of that, that idea. So, and on the book flaps of the company store, we have the miners have always been paid starvation wages by companies that had total monopolies in such towns as Glace Bay. The first time they launched a strike in 1905, soldiers were brought in, and machine guns and barbed wire were set up around the mining community. Credit was cut off in the company stores, the only stores. Miners were evicted from company-owned houses, the only houses. In the middle of winter, the death toll was enormous. And then David Frank wrote, to many, Glace Bay embodied the physical bleakness and social dependency of the early 20th century coal town. There were whole new neighborhoods of company houses, and the mayor was also the general manager of the company stores. And I'm not sure, I've tried to check this out. I don't know if company stores means the retail outlets or areas such as the Sterling Yard, where equipment and machinery and such for the mines were stored. It doesn't really matter. Mr. Birchall was the mayor. Noted the Canadian Mining Journal in 1908, everybody in Glace Bay is a servant of the coal company or a servant of the coal company. So in my book, Early Glace Bay, I paint a picture of a town that's lively. It has many stores, many different stores, specialty stores like milliners and fur stores and music stores. There were opticians and a female osteopath. There were 2 Jewish delis, 6 Chinese laundries. McLachlan spoke at 2 of the theaters, the Dreamland and the casino. There was also the King's Theater that had held 1,000 people and had a basketball court in the basement. And many hotels, restaurant, ice cream parlors, etc. And this is McHarold's general store. This is from 1907. This is 2 years before McLachlan came to Glace Bay. Largest department store east of Montreal. This is Glace Bay Harbor, and I'd hoped I was able to enlarge this picture, but I can't. Down on the far left is a large building that is the coal pier for the mines north of the harbor. And I think where we are here is about, or where this picture is from, is about where the coal pier was for the Caledonia mine. And of course, there's all this activity in the harbor that is in excess of what is going on with the mining industry. So yes, everybody had a connection to the mining industry, it seems. It's a picture of the company store in Caledonia, one of the opportunities where women worked, and we can see a large number of people working there. I have this picture here in particular because it will, there will be a contrast to this later on. This is the McIntyre pipe band. All these guys are brothers. There's one brother-in-law there, John Jameson there in the middle. They're from French Road, if anybody's from French Road sitting in on this. And Tablehead Athletic Club. You can't see my dad, or you can, I can't, because he's in that second row on the end behind the list of names that I have listed up here from the, anyway, what we discussed earlier. These men were all miners in Tablehead. They built what would you call it? A building, let's say, where they held dances to raise money to buy sports equipment for the children of the neighborhood, and they taught them to play sports as well. This is 1925 when things were really bad, but people were still living their lives. And here we have all kinds of sports teams, very competitive. And here we have, there were lots of women's teams as well. On the left is a basketball team from 1908, and I'm not sure the date of the women's hockey team, but certainly it was early in the century. Largest house in Glace Bay was owned not by anybody from the coal company, but this was from Jack McRae. He came to Glace Bay with the Rhodes Curry people who built most of the, a lot of the company houses that were built in 1901. He found the importation and sale of liquor much more to his benefit in Glace Bay. Later, it was turned into a funeral home. That's why the parking lot in front instead of the beautiful gardens that were there in other pictures I've seen. So we'll put J.B. McLachlan into this picture. Blacklisted from several mines in Scotland, hired by the GMA operation in Sydney Mines. Becomes very active in the union. PWA is the union, and it's a closed shop. So he's only there a short time when he starts criticizing the company and the union in print and vocally. Got blacklisted. I think probably it's questionable whether he got fired from the mine and therefore had to leave the union, or the union kicked him out and therefore he lost his job. I think it's more likely that it was the union that kicked him out, because he ended up with a lifelong hatred for the PWA, which is the Provincial Workmen's Union. He was hired by the United Mine Workers of America with their District 26 headquarters in Glace Bay. And one of the things that he was very strong in doing was promoting class consciousness, which was familiar to the immigrants from the British immigrants. I should mention that after the mines were consolidated, the GMA was not part of this, but the mines south of Sydney Harbor were consolidated in 1893 into the Dominion Coal Company, and they brought immigrants in from all over the world, but the largest proportion of them were from Britain and Europe. The PWA members in Cape Breton were mostly second and third generation Cape Bretoners from the rural areas, mostly Catholic, mostly Gaelic speaking and working at home. Like the mainland, they supported the checkout system for doctors in the hospital and schools, and the insurance policies that were really important to women, as well as debt to the company store. These were all really beneficial to the wives, the miners' wives. And also, there is an argument that the checkout system was the forerunner of our Canadian medical system. They very much wanted to see mining as a respectable occupation. And I'm going ahead to the next file to see if, no, it's not there. I have not been able to find out if this is true for sure, but I have the understanding that the PWA had a system whereby men who had large families or were disabled actually were paid higher wages. McLachlan, as I said, hired by the UMW in 1909 at a salary of $200 a month, about $3,000 plus expenses. From his farm, he sold milk and eggs into the mining community, and his son told David Frank that if miners didn't have the money, the McLachlans were content to take clothes, shoes, food, etc. in barter. In 1926, the Royal Commission, the Duncan Royal Commission, it was found that in 1922, when things had been so desperate in Glace Bay, that in fact, McLachlan was writing in the Maritime Labor Herald that children were dying from lack of milk, that he colluded with other milk producers to raise the price by 2 cents a quart. He promoted communism, or at least that's what he, constantly argued that the miners should run the mines. But we'll never know really how much the communist influence there was, because most of the references are to McLachlan's own opinion or to those who wrote about the man and the times, to interviewees anxious to provide a good story, and to McLachlan's effective use of creating divisions and using peer pressure and bullying. Another dense slide here. In 1909, McLachlan was so anxious to get even with the PWA that he rushed his UMW supporters into an unfortunate strike. At the time, the PWA was so sure of winning that a lot of the members didn't bother to vote. So it came out pretty well, 50-50. At that time, violence ensued. The company applied to have the military brought in. The story goes that the town of Glace Bay would not support the arrival of the military because they supported the miners. And that may have been true, since the mayor of the town at the time was also worked for the union. But it's more likely they didn't want to incur the costs of having the military there. So, as I said, the violence ensued. One of the things that happened, and let me digress for a second to say that what you're seeing on the slide right now is one of the things that really caught my attention when I was rereading labor history in Cape Breton. Because I looked at what happened here and saw that my grandfathers would be on different sides of this event, and that my paternal great-grandfather would have been on the same side as my maternal grandfather. My paternal grandfather was an early supporter of the UMW. It didn't last forever, but it did happen then. My maternal grandfather was a member of the PWA, and my great-grandfather would have been a member of the PWA as well. Anyway, so we have the members of the UMW on a march to Dominion. The majority of the UMW people live in New Aberdeen or in Caledonia, some of them. The people in the Dominion and Bridgeport area were mostly Catholic. I found a magazine, newspaper article back in the turn of the 20th century that said all of Iona has removed to Bridgeport. And all of Iona then, as now, was mostly Catholic. So it was pretty obvious that that was a Catholic territory. So they came around the corner of Cadigan's Brook, and there was a machine gun on the steps of the church in Bridgeport. They turned around, went back to Glace Bay, and had a rally condemning the Catholic Church for being against the miners. McLachlan used the same argument running against a Catholic in 1920, and in 1926 accused the Catholic Church and the Liberal government of supporting the mining company Besco. And another story was that Father Fraser, who this story I've heard myself recently, was the parish priest at St. John's in New Aberdeen, and that he had opened the basement of the church to families who were put out of their company houses, and whether there are two different stories. One is that one of the other priests rode through the night to Agnes to get the bishop to take Father Fraser out of Glace Bay. The other story is that an executive of the union phoned the bishop with the same request, and that night Father Fraser was yanked out of Glace Bay and deposited in the rural area of Antigonish. Father Fraser was still at St. John's in 1916, publicly supported the UMW, wrote letters to the Prime Minister in favor of the union, asking for him to get involved in the UMW, and wrote many letters to the newspapers and such supporting the UMW. The strike failed, mostly because the men were not united, and most of them joined the PWA and went back to work. So labor historians condemn the calling out of the military to protect property and enforce the peace, yet seemed to support violence the military was there to avert. In 1909, innocent people, the miners still working for the PWA who had no reason not to keep working, they were viciously attacked in their homes and on the street, called scab. Terrible things were done to them to try to force them to join a union they didn't agree with. What might have happened if the military was not there? Would Miller's comment about the enormous loss of life actually have become a reality? I have this slide in here as one of several that kind of go to J.B. McLachlan's personality. He continued to be paid by the UMW until 1916 at least. Then he formed an independent union, United Mine Workers of Nova Scotia, in 1917, with a similar salary. And while all of this is going on, he's in continuous contact with the UMW, promising to bring it back to Nova Scotia. The Amalgamated Mine Workers then is formed from the PWA and the UMWNS in 1918, and they somehow need the same services by McLachlan at the same income. So he brings back the UMW in 1919 with that same salary of $200 plus expenses. But in 1930, he's been fired by the UMW, which we will get to later. And in 1930, he wrote, United Mine Workers came to Nova Scotia in 1919, having repeatedly refused until men were 100% organized. The UMW refused to give me $1 of an organizer when the mines were in the midst of a struggle against the company, the PWA, and the grid government. Only when the miners became an unencumbered source of revenue would Indianapolis consent to take them over. This revisionist history is really common with him. I have several other examples as well of the man who hired him, John C. Douglas, who hired him in Glace Bay in 1909, ran against him in an election in 1920. And McLachlan took him on about how much he was paid. He was paid $120 a month by the union, and McLachlan turned this into him making vast amounts of money and destroying the union. And I will tell you again, I hope you don't mind that there, as I said, there is this block on the right-hand side of my screen. So there are words I'm not seeing, and I'm glad you can't. David Frank and others wrote that, J.B. McLachlan was a one-man show. He was hired as secretary treasurer of the union, but he did all the negotiating. He wrote all the contracts. He took the government to court. He did. So you kind of wonder why they bothered having an executive or hiring legal counsel. And so he also apparently learned mathematics, economics, and Greek by correspondence. Fortunately, he was able to read very complex financial statements and understand them as a result of, I guess, as a result of that. But it seems to me that when it comes to negotiation and economics, he wasn't that great. For instance, 3 major strikes in 4 years and others as well lead me to question his negotiating skills. And actually in 1922, so did the rank and file of the union, but we'll get to that. In the meantime, I've read many of the labor historians praising the wee dark. In this case, McLachlan wasn't happy with how fast the negotiations were going on with BESCO. And they were threatening, their opening stance was to cut wages by a third. So he decided to have the miners, lessen their production by a third. Robert Baxter called it illegal, and others refused to go along as well. Officially, it only lasted about 12 days and it failed. Nobody asked the women if they were okay losing that income. And apparently no one asked McLachlan if he was going to reduce his income or the price of milk. The slowdown actually benefited the company. The company first of all, had 100,000, in excess of 100,000 tons of coal stockpiled on the coal floor at New Aberdeen. And they were paying royalties to the government as the coal came up the mine shaft. So by slowing down how it was coming up the shaft, was slowing down the royalties that the company had to pay to the government. And they already had their stockpile of coal. So the only people who really lost was the government of Nova Scotia, meaning all of us, or all of them, and the loss of income to those families who participated. So the district convention was held in June in Truro, and the moderate members of the executive were voted out and the radicals voted in. The convention approved famine relief to Russia, which is interesting since 1922 was such a bad time in Nova Scotia. $5,000 to the Maritime Labor Herald. Has anybody noticed how that looks like the McLachlan Herald? Anyway, just a sidebar there. But mostly the complete overthrow of the capitalist system and the capitalist state, peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must. I think the only reason John L. Lewis, head of the UMW, didn't fire McLachlan and Livingston right then was the conditions were so bad in the States with real labor wars, not what we were calling labor wars, or what historians were. And it almost wrecked the union. And in fact, that was the plan in the States. So anyway, he didn't, he let that go. But in July, the rank and file of the UMW demanded that their legal counsel, Gordon Harrington, negotiate for them. Harrington and Dr. Clarence McKinnon achieved a small increase in salary, but mostly a long-term contract, which was what the miners wanted most. So shortly after that, actually in the middle of all of this, it was that McLachlan called 100% strike in support of a violent strike by about half of the workers of the Sydney steel plant. The strikers didn't belong to the UMW and didn't want to join the UMW. They wanted to join another union. But McLachlan, having been a signatory to that contract, 16 months, and 8 months into it, calling the strike, that's when he got fired by the head of the union. But before that happened, 160,000 tons of coal on the coal floor at number 2 colliery started to heat up. There's up to, I tried to figure out, what 160,000 tons would look like, and the closest I could come to is a 30-story building. Probably not, but anyway, pretty close. It was in the middle of thousands of homes in Glace Bay and could reach New Waterford and Duncan compared with the wind, which way the wind was blowing. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide first, and so you can have a look at this. If you look at where it has where the Marconi site is, and there's a blue little bit of a lake, it's called the dam. And if you go from that straight over to Dominion, almost to Seaside Drive, or no, where it says Dominion Beach Park, that was totally flat. The French called it the table because it was so flat. Actually, there was a mining community down there in the 1700s. So it's totally flat, totally open, no trees, straight across to New Waterford on the north and Duncan on the south. So the coal started to smolder in the heat. And an executive from the coal company called McLachlan and said, okay, we got a 100% strike on here, but please just let us get some people in there to cool off the hot spots. And as many times as I've read this, I still get emotional about it. McLachlan said, the headline, the company's coal can go to hell. And at the Duncan Royal Commission, he actually bragged that the coal was burning, saying, yeah, I guess so. There are children running in that direction. So this is like the top of the town with tens of thousands of people around, some of them already compromised with, the breathing difficulties or, black lung syndrome, or not healthy due to malnutrition and other things. And he is there playing chicken with the coal company. And so when he gets fired, your deliberate breach of the contract is indefensible and morally reprehensible. Your assault upon the laws and institutions of your provincial government departments cannot be countenanced by the United Mine Workers of America. And so my question here to labor historians is, they claim that Lewis betrayed McLachlan. And who was betrayed here? Didn't McLachlan betray the union and the miners? And again, in 1925, when conditions in Glace Bay were so bad that individuals and corporations were sending money and supplies to keep people from starving, McLachlan, the comfort of his farm outside town, condemned the union executive for begging and being respectable and diminishing the fighting spirit of the men. Some of you might remember or recall that one of the people who came to Glace Bay, who wrote stories and painted pictures there, was Lauren Harris, and he wrote some pretty stark stories about what was going on at the time. And Agnes MacPhail, member of Parliament for Grey South in Ontario, came to Glace Bay and met McLachlan. Now, this is the impression she left with. He's endeavoring to break the bonds. He's endeavoring to save a little money to buy a plot of ground and a home. He's endeavoring to get some culture. Now, I thought she was talking about miners at this point, but then she went on to say he has a beautiful family, rosy-cheeked wife with rolling Scottish tongue, and he is a man who always stood for good citizenship. Please note why he was just fired. For other women in Glace Bay, it wasn't so rosy. MacPhail claimed the life of a woman in Glace Bay in 1925 was a tragedy. It's interesting that, I mean, his farm was paid for 7 years before this interview, and I doubt very much if MacPhail misunderstood what she was being told. And in 1926, at the Royal Commission, McLachlan, who constantly talked about how the miners should run the mine, was asked about the miners running the mine, and this is what he had to say. And if I can't see it all, then you people can read it. I'll read what I can. There may be the odd man here or there who would inquire into the circumstances of the business, but it's a great broad mass. I'm sorry, you can see it. To tell these men that the company is not making money, that means nothing to the ordinary man. He wants to make a living out of it. No matter how widespread your depression is or how widespread the competition is, that's nothing to the ordinary man. All he sees is his day's work and pay. You may say, sorry, the word behind there for Germany and France or Britain is the factor in the competition, but that's too far-fetched for him. So who was it that was going to run the mines on behalf of the workers, since they didn't know anything? Let's go on. So pretty well, though, in 1925, or after 1925, he was pretty well a spent force, really. But he was being paid then by the Communist Party, and God knows how much money they ran into Cape Breton through McLachlan. McLachlan used it again. He was very good at, when I mentioned about his ability to use masculinity against the miners. One of the things that he did with the money was provided to women's study groups, communist study groups, and they gave some of it back to the Labor Herald, and he then, started a competition, tried to, between the women and the men of the community to support the magazine or the newspaper. So he was still out to destroy the UAW in 1929. And when he wrote that the days of peace in the coal fields were coming to an end, time for a new class struggle. It's interesting, isn't it? The days of peace are coming to an end. He was starting a new union, going to get rid of the UMW. Again, the same, the Mine Workers Industrial Union of Nova Scotia. About 30 people showed up for the initial organization. When some questioned the advisability of having McLachlan involved, he resigned and decided that the union was going to work. That followed by the amalgamated mine workers, which failed as well. Like in 1917, one was to be independent and the other was to be affiliated, this time with the Communist Party instead of the UMW. He then had trouble with the communist leadership. When he was passed over to be a delegate to the Communist Party to go to representative to go to Moscow, he was furious. Tim Buck wrote to someone else that it would be damned foolishness to send a man to the USSR who can drop the work of the party unceremoniously when his pet feelings have been a little hurt. And McLachlan embarrassed the American miner heading the delegation by writing directly to Moscow to complain. We get to the Maritime Labor Herald. It was started in 1922. David Frank wrote 21, and actually, I'm not quite sure which it is. My references are 1922. And twice he was able to remove any competition for him to be the main writer and editor of that newspaper. In 1924, a delegation from Caledonia appealed to the shareholders of the Herald to have a meeting to discuss its editorial policy, complaining that under McLachlan it had become a voice for communist propaganda. McLachlan responded that he was not built to report other people's ideas. He had his own opinions and would use the paper to express them. So much of labor history in coal towns, especially Glace Bay, result from repetition of McLachlan's opinions and stories. That's not to say they were all false, but to go back to Forbes, fact and fiction were jumbled together. Here's a picture of one of the things that concerns me greatly about some of the labor history is that they seem to, support is not the right word. They seem to think violence was an appropriate measure. And if you look here, I have this picture of the Reserve Mines company store. I have it there in contrast to the happy people looking at the one in Caledonia before. This is 1925. And the miners went on a binge, as a friend of mine said, the euphoria of the violence, because you can see the house next door was also attacked. And though we're told let me back up for a second here. So we had the violence in 1909. We had the violence in Sydney in 1923. And by the way, if you really want to read about that, the Cape Breton, sorry, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was, if someone can remember it, perhaps it's the one, some online stories of Cape Breton over the years. And I'm sorry, I can't even remember the editor's name right now. Sorry, it will come to me. Anyway, there was that in 1923. And then in 1925, somehow the story gets twisted around to support the union, the miners who were rioting, when executives of the union were managing the power plant in New Waterford to keep the power on to the hospital. Miners broke in and dragged them out, and the police came along, and Jim Davis got killed, and there's various versions about why that happened. So what would have happened, if the military had not intervened? I got ahead of myself with this. But, with the years that McLachlan spent causing divisions in culture, religion, and gender, with the lost wages and the unnecessary violence, what actually did the man accomplish? I will agree that the miners would go to see Jim speak. He said they filled the auditoriums, and I have no doubt he did. They would go there and they stomp and yell, "Driver Jim, you tell them, Jim." And that Jim's some talker, especially when he takes his teeth out. There's an attribution, but well, you know what I mean. Then they go home and they talk about it in the pit the next day, and they talk about the fact that Jim McLachlan can talk all he wants, but he's got his income and his farm, and he's got nothing to lose. And then they go to the polls. Jim McLachlan ran for office 5 times, and only once did he not finish at the bottom of the pack. It appears the majority of coal miners do not see communism as the way forward, or Jim McLachlan as their hero. So it's a time for that critical analysis that Forbes mentioned. Much that we have seen in labor history as repetition of the opinions of J.B. McLachlan. Perhaps it is time for a critical analysis. Why was it that the company was pumping so much money into the mines and the surface when they were refusing to offer increased wages to the miners? The company gave women the dual gifts of improved wash houses at the mine site so the more men could get washed and changed before they headed home. And they also, in 1925, when things were so bad, they installed water in the company houses. Why was that happening? Why were those two dual things happening? And maybe a feminist historian might want to take a look at J.B. McLachlan's curious attitude toward women. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Carole. I think we were all fine with you not being able to see certain parts of the text, so don't worry about that.
Okay.
That was awesome. Thanks so much. I really like the family connection to the history. I know it's a kind of an emotional thing for you, I can tell. So we'll start with the question and answer period. Does anybody have any questions? And Carole, if you want, you can stop sharing your slide, or you can just leave it up.
Okay, is stop screen sharing or stop?
Yeah, stop sharing the screen. You don't have to, but it'll just bring up everyone's, everybody will be able to see the video a little bit clearer.
Yeah, okay.
It'll come up as like tiles everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. So you can send a message in the chat to ask a question, or you could also unmute yourself, turn your camera on if you'd like to talk directly.
No question. That means it was either very good or very bad.
I see a camera coming. Usually the first question, people take a couple minutes to warm up, so don't worry. Anthony, do you have a question?
Yeah, I must admit I found the presentation pretty unhelpful in the sense of the way that it took all these little pokes at Ms. McLachlan and without really much substance behind it. So let me ask Carole one question: How many miners died in the coal mines of Cape Breton through that period? All right.
I really don't know. And
yeah, exactly. So that's kind of my point, right? I mean, so you focus on one or two or some threats of violence. There were.
They weren't in the coal mine, though. Those
they weren't. Yeah, I know they weren't in the coal mines. That's the whole point. Why was McLachlan such a radical? Why was he so engaged on the issues of social justice? Because people were being sent down those pits, miners and ponies and children, boys, down into those mines, and they had a very high risk of not coming back up. I mean, 1,300, I'll give you the answer. The answer is over 1,300 miners died in the mines of Cape Breton. And now that's an exception.
During what time? Sorry?
I think it's about the century. I think it's about 1880 to 1980 or
Century.
something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So in that area. And so this is not a social gathering we're dealing with here. These are people who are fighting for their lives. I shouldn't have to say this to somebody like yourself who has such strong Cape Breton pedigree, but if you prefer to lean on the side of Mr. Harrington and Mr. McLachlan, that helps clarify the nature of the debate. They were both political figures, and they were both very engaged with Cape Bretoners. Harrington won as a conservative. So the politics of Cape Breton, industrial Cape Breton are complicated indeed. You make the point that McLachlan never won an election for public office. This is true. Do you know how many he won for the executive of the union, whether it was PWA, whether it was UMW? I mean, I can think of at least 6 or 8 of them or whatever when he stood for election there. I mean, he was trusted by the miners to get certain things done. I mean, I'm not going to speak to the issue of the gender side to it. There's more levels of complexity to that. I mean, if you know, when they were trying to negotiate better wages with the mines, he went back to the women of the miners' wives, and he got them to do their family budgets so that he could bring those numbers to show that they were paying starvation wages that people couldn't afford. You dismissively talk about the trashing of the company store. As you will well know, the company stores were known as pluck me's, right? Pluck me's in the community because they plucked every little penny from the pockets of the people, such that sometimes at the end of the month, they didn't have any money to go with, right? So, and the religious pieces of it, again, that was pretty shoddy. There were all sorts of religious divisions and political divisions, Protestant, Catholic, liberal, conservative, laid on each other, minor, commercial, rural, urban, laid onto each other. It's a complicated thing to try to simplify the way you did. I don't think it did the analysis any credit. So anyhow, that's just my 2 cents. I'm sorry for that. But I just think that, yeah, I mean, if you're trying to dismiss Mr. McLachlan, you haven't done a very good job. Was he a communist? Absolutely. And did he get political support for that in public politics? Absolutely not. But that said, did the workers appreciate and respect his role in trying to get them better wages, better living, and better working conditions? Absolutely. To blame the man because he gets blacklisted from the mines that he then has to make his living on a farm and is no longer a miner. That wasn't his choice. He was blacklisted. I mean, maybe you can make the case he shouldn't have done as much. He should have, been more conciliatory. But anyhow, I just think it's very contentious, very problematic. But it was an interesting presentation. So I'll thank you for that.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Where do you get your research information for your opinions?
Oh, I mean, I've just read many of the books that you've done there. My background, my personal history is I spent many years with the Extension Department of St. Yves, so we have all sorts of a good understanding of coal mine organizations, dealings with the church and with the different communities. But I'm not an academic, so if that's what you're looking for, I'm not.
No, I'm not. I will tell you that I actually lost 2 uncles in the coal mine myself.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that I have talked at length with my parents and my grandparents, and I appreciate your opinion, but to me, it just seems to be the same old that I've just heard forever from labor historians. But thank you.
Not a problem. Thank you for the presentation and the work you've done on it.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony. I know this topic is contentious, but I just want to remind everyone to stay respectful and polite, okay? Yep. We have a question from David Fleming in the chat. How do you think JB would react to the current insurrection, in quotation marks, across Canada?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things I was going to start with, and I didn't, is that J.B. McLachlan to me is a populist. He was very much in line with what would be going on today. He was one who was really able to use division and an experienced, a wonderful speaker, and really could get people moving and motivated for a time. And I think he'd be all for what's going on today.
Lois, I had noticed your hand went up. I don't know if you had a question or if you were just.
No, my comment was simply going to be that these presentations are very much to bring together people with opposing or different viewpoints. I think that's one of the important things this evening. Anthony, we thank you. Carole, we are very pleased to hear another part of the story, another way of looking at things. We don't want to use presentism. We want as much as possible to insert ourselves into the past and try to learn more about that past from a healthy discussion. So I'm going to step back here. I see Anne Marie Lane Jones.
Oh, I don't know, I think Lois cut out, but Anne Marie, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. I had one observation. I think, Carole, you were trying to think of a source on Cape Breton, and I believe that you might have been referring to Ron Kaplan's Cape
Yes.
Breton magazine,
Yes.
which I would like to suggest to people, as I think it is a fantastic source of a very broad range of community history. So I think it is something to look upon. I was, as you were developing your story, and although I'm very familiar with Cape Breton, I'm not a labor historian or familiar with labor history, but have for a number of projects looked at the early 20th century, and I'm certainly as a period of both political and labor unrest, as well as a period of very intense reactions to this unrest, of efforts to maintain the power structure of the empire as a lot of important shifts were happening. um, that there are global things going on in Cape Breton. As you mentioned, in a few instances, I mean, we have McLachlan himself and his own experiences. We have the religious strife that you mentioned, and there's also like that very strong reaction to communism and a lot of fear of it in the class structure of North America. And you mentioned American strife, and I wonder, like, do you situate this situation? Do you situate that what's happening in Cape Breton? Is this part of a global movement? Because you do seem very focused on McLachlan and his own efforts. But like, how would you put this in the context of what was going on in the United States at the time? Because there was a great deal of labor unrest going on at that time. So putting, as you do, McLachlan at very center of it, there, that I just wonder how you reconcile that with the larger strife that was taking place in the Western world at that time.
One of the articles I discovered was that in 1921, and I didn't include this because I'm not sure whether it was before or after BESCO took over the mines. There was a meeting between the union and whoever, whether it was DOSCO or BESCO running the mines at that point, at which the general manager of BESCO had come back from Montreal and said things were so bad because of the depression, the post-war depression, and the amount of coal that was coming into major parts of Canada from the United States, that they were going to have to close some mines. And the union asked, and the company agreed, that rather than closing some mines and putting people out of work, that they would put everybody on part-time, which seemed to me far different from what was going on in the States. And I do understand your question, but at the same time, one of the things I read was about the Blair Mountain Massacre, where people who had fought together overseas were actually shooting at each other, and the government was sending people in to murder union people. And actually the UMW almost went bankrupt during that time because of bailing people out of jail and that sort of thing. In 1922, I'm sorry, I just had a brain freeze. A wonderful Canadian historian, Desmond Morton, told me that his father was in the military and stationed in Winnipeg after the war, but one of his close associates was with the military in Glace Bay. The military was ordered to stay under canvas at number 2 colliery. And apparently what he told, and this I'll have to go back and include McLachlan again, but what he was told, what Desmond Morton's father was told, was that the miners recognized each other from when they were overseas, and they actually played baseball games against each other on the coal floor. And again, I will have to go back to the way McLachlan interpreted, because he talked about the women taking their children to taunt the masculinity of the soldiers, and I just find that really hard to believe that any women would have had the time to do that at that time. But I guess what I'm saying is I see a very big difference in how Canadians and local people handled the distress of the situation than it was held in the United States. Does that answer your question, Anne-Marie? Or help to answer it?
I think so. I think it is some perspective. I mean, I think that you know, that it's from the bit that, I mean, it is an intensely difficult period, and there seemed to be a lot of crises, and there seemed to be some thoughts that were unthinkable, such as that perhaps the wealthy should be a little less wealthy, or that there was some way of supporting workers through this, but that that the situation, you know, from my understanding, and I mean, just personally being familiar with McLennan as an author related to Louisbourg, was that there was an untouchable class in Cape Breton that lived in a way so removed from how the working people lived that you know, it doesn't surprise me that that frustration would have spilled over into action, and I don't know that I see that as being profoundly different from what was being experienced in other places. And I mean, in the end, that certainly there was that the measures against communism across North America were quite strongly concerted. But there's also, you know, McLachlan, I don't know personally his like that whole history, but I just wonder, is it really that removed from these processes that are taking place in other places to make sure that that idea of communism does not take hold in North America, because there are concerted forces that were very determined that that would not happen. But and I see that at work in Cape Breton as well as in other places. But you know, McLachlan's failures as a leader aside, I you know, I still feel like that whatever perceptions you might have of him, that the tensions go further than the history of one person.
Can I just make one comment about what you said? And we talked about the people who lived separately from the rest of the people. As I said earlier on, I wrote about Glace Bay, and there was nothing like that in Glace Bay. I mean, I know I'm a later generation. The idea of class is not anything. In fact, you know, they will tell you that the Highland Scottish tradition is what really ran the town of Glace Bay. And so I'll tell you, Highland Scots don't think anybody's better than they are.
I think Leo DeVoe was also just mentioning in the comments that it was the Ron Kaplan book, the reference that you were looking for, and also I was also wondering what Gordon Harrington's impressions were of McLachlan.
He didn't say anything about it. I know that Desmond Morton told me that he thought that Gordon Harrington would have considered McLachlan just a nuisance. But I know they worked together earlier, before the war. They worked together for the UMW in Glace Bay. I think Harrington, like a lot of people, when he came back from overseas, had a broader view of the world, and he worked I tried to keep him out of this as much as possible because I didn't want it to become, I'm sorry, somebody already had taken up the fact that I was promoting Harrington, and that certainly was not my intention. I mentioned it when it was fit the narrative. But I think when it came to fighting for the miners, that Harrington achieved a lot more than J.B. McLachlan did.
Thanks. So have a hand raised, P. Ludlow, I think. Peter Ludlow, yeah. Was looking to ask a question.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Carole, for your talk. One of the things I'm interested in is myth. I mean, I think really what you're getting at is that, you know, we've kind of accepted a lot of things as being canon that maybe we should reevaluate. I mean, there's no question that there is a lot of myth, especially when it comes to the religious narrative. I was really lucky years ago to study under John Reed, who I'm sure is on this call, and we went through a lot of these things in terms of the Catholic Church. And we found a lot of myth. And, you know, you brought up the Bridgeport incident and, you know, Father Fraser over in New Aberdeen. And I think that's really important. And, you know, why do these myths begin and why they last so well? So I think that's very positive. And I think we should look at that. I mean, McLachlan's an interesting guy to me because, you know, I think he's more of a nuisance than a threat. I think that's, you know, he's perceived as being a real threat. But I think he's more of a nuisance, but he scares people in 1935. There's no question. Federal election 1935, you know, some 5,000, many of them Catholic people vote for a communist candidate. That scares people. But then by 1936, you have, you know, really detailed reports that the Catholic hierarchy in this case is writing to Rome saying, well, communism's not really a threat. You know, they're more concerned that the liberals, it's interesting, the liberals and the Tories aren't really representing the people in the way they should. And the CCF comes in and you know, that's a whole other topic, a very important topic. But I just I'm interested in myth. Why you think that some of these things have the lasting power that they do? You know, the machine gun incident is a perfect example. Charlie MacDonald, who starts St. Joseph's Hospital, right? You know, he's the priest there. He's very involved in that. Yeah. And he never ever gave, you know, and this was reported at the time, he never ever gave permission to put that machine gun there. There was a captain came in that said they want to put some soldiers on the side of the church, and you know, how that lasted so long. You know, why is that? Do you think that myth has the kind of power that it does?
I think it's the way the stories are told. And I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to do what I did today, because the stories that we were told were pretty well the stories about the hero McLachlan, and that, you know, there was the church trying to shut him down. Why? I just think another narrative has not come up to take that on. I think people, if I go back to Forbes and what he said, people just repeating the same old stories over and over again until they get to be accepted as history. And certainly that one about that was a shock to me when I discovered that about the leader of the Orange Lodge in Glace Bay riding a white horse into a Catholic territory. I mean, we hear enough about the Falls Road incidents in Belfast to know what was going to happen if they hadn't been stopped. But that story doesn't get told often enough. I don't know if that's what you were meaning, Peter.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think the thing is, it's like, to me, like 09 is really a civil war, if you think of it, and these people are born and bred in these communities. And so it's not surprising you'd have a priest or a minister on one side and a priest or a minister on the other side. But the narrative really was that there are two sides. And I think that's the complexities we need to look for. And it is complicated. And there are many sides in these things. And so that's what I think really that I would pull from this, that we got to go back and look at it in that way. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I don't know if you can see, Carole, but Victoria Stewart in the chat just left a comment for you, said that it was very fascinating, and that rightfully so, the nature of historiography is not to blindly accept narrative myths. So
Thank you.
Paul Bennett looks like would like to ask a question.
Well, thank you, Carole, for a very stimulating talk.
Thanks,
I didn't
Paul.
know what to expect, but you didn't disappoint tonight with stirring up some issues that I think needed to be discussed. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was looking at the monument to J.B. McLachlan in Glace Bay, and it seems he's a bit of a deity up there even today. So I think deities perhaps every once in a while need to be reviewed. My question really is about the historiography of how we got David Frank's interpretation. And I go back to the great debates over the difference between labor history and working class history in that particular period when David Frank and the others all wrote their books. And they seem to be reacting against labor history as written by Eugene Forsey and Desmond Morton, for example, who were much more sympathetic to organized labor within the confines of recognized labor unions operating within the boundaries of labor law. And then you have the working class scholars who came along and who tried to, I guess, find people like McLachlan who challenged the orthodoxy of the labor unions. So my question really is, have you done much work on the historiography that helps to explain why J.B. McLachlan and all those who are kind of working class heroes got to be as prominent as they are today?
I will answer that, but I have a question for you first. You said you saw what J.B. McLachlan said about education. What is your take on that, being involved in education as you are?
I really don't know a
what
whole lot about his views on education. I'm more interested in trying to help you to flesh out the historiography that might give a little bit more context to your interpretation. I'm actually sympathetic to raising questions about J.B. McLachlan by putting it in the context of, isn't it time that we reevaluated the standard tropes about working class history?
Well, actually, the reason I asked you that is because that Karen in Glace Bay really irritates me, because I don't really understand what he's saying. It sounds to me like he's saying like people should be educated to be not educated, and also talks about people should learn value, but there's no discussion about what value means or what value he's talking about. But to go back to David Frank, he wrote at one point that he started this because as a kid in Toronto, he was watching the people delivering coal and began to wonder stories about, but he went back to Glace Bay and he interviewed people. And that's when I talk about people wanting to give good stories, because some of the stories that he collected were pretty fantastic. And I do want to say that one of the things that I find very interesting is that his book, which I don't think is as much a biography as, well, it's not, but it's much more balanced than his articles that he writes. If you've read any of his articles, they're very questionable.
They all started in Labor Le Travailleur.
I'm sorry?
They all know each other.
And they all
of the people that are writing about McLachlan, they're
and they all use each other as reference.
Actually, they agree with one another. We're talking about why there haven't been others that have come along to challenge them, aren't we?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we started with. That as for the Maritime provinces, nothing ever happens down there, so why bother? And I mean, let me give an example of that. When I showed the picture of Glace Bay and I showed what was said about the, this historic site in Glace Bay, I mean, didn't all the stuff we're dealing with start in Glace Bay? Isn't this what Marconi started in Glace Bay, and that nobody has bothered to put up something reasonable as a recognition of what happened there? And I think it's all part of that. Well, it's the Maritimes,
No, I think it has more to do with a group of scholars who formed a school of thought and who all thought alike and produced graduate students that replicated their work.
Oh, yes.
Isn't it that simple?
You're absolutely right about that.
And you have to have somebody that comes from outside that world
They all do.
has the temerity to say,
Oh,
you know, let's re-examine some of the things we hold as being, you know, heretic, anything that's a heresy involved in challenging these things. And it often comes from people like yourself who, you know, come at it from a different angle, and others will follow. So you're actually maybe empowering and encouraging others to step out and take the same risks.
oh, that would be lovely. Thanks, Paul. I hope
Yeah, I'm
you're
turning it
right.
up into a positive.
Thanks for that.
I enjoyed it.
Good, thank you.
I think I take the view that it doesn't hurt to re-examine things like this every once in a while and ask the questions that are uncomfortable for people that have, you know, repeated this over and over again.
And I
think
will
that
say,
you give people a lot to think about tonight.
thank you, because as I was putting this together, one of the things that kept going through my mind was, who cares? And it just came down to, I do. And I'm thankful that the society let me make this presentation tonight. Thank you for your comments.
Thanks, Paul and Carol. Does anybody else have any last minute questions? John McLeod says that Spring Hill and Pictou County have similar mining histories to Glace Bay and Cape Breton County. Is what we now see as radicalism in the Cape Breton mines something that wasn't on the mainland, or again, is that part of the popular story?
What I did, John, I read some of Ian McKay's work and saw that, you know, we had a lot in common, but mostly when David Frank and others wrote about this, they wrote about Glace Bay. And since I am from there and know that best, that, you know, I really don't know that I can answer your question, because I come from the Glace Bay, Cape Breton perspective.
More research for you.
Sorry.
I said more research opportunity for you.
Oh, no. For somebody, I hope.
David Fleming says, congratulations and to the society and to the speaker for a stimulating evening. So I think we'll stop there. Thanks you so much, Carol. Lois is going to say a little, you know, outro, but I will also say that we're going back to Cape Breton next month on March 16th. Dr. Hilary Doda's topic is nostalgia, longing, and the embedded self, overshot weaving and stories of place in Cape Breton. So it's going to be another interesting one. Yeah.
Great.
Join
Good.
us then on the 16th of March.
Good. Thank you, Sarah.
I just wanted to say thank you as well, Carol. I believe that history has to be re-examined every 20 years. That's a credo of mine. And you have given us a very provocative presentation. You may just stir things up among some of the members of the audience this evening. It's been very exhilarating. One last thought. I wonder what J.B. McLachlan and Joey Smallwood would be like in a room together.
I doubt anybody else could hear anything.
Might be. There's some interesting parallels there. The new
Yes.
biography of Joey and how he started, and
Mhm.
his union activities, and
Yeah.
the community supporting him or divided against him. We won't get into that this evening, but I think it would be interesting to have them in the room. The
Mhm.
women wouldn't get a word in edgewise. No,
Definitely not.
no.
No.
Thank you, everyone, very much. This is what makes the Historical Society an interesting organization. We'll look forward to seeing most of you again, I hope, next month. Good night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.